History forgot his name. Not immediately. Not while the church bells of Europe were ringing and the Pope was writing letters of gratitude. Later, gradually. The way men are forgotten when the countries they save decide the story belongs to someone else. But on the morning of September 12th, 1683, before any of that, a man in full armor is kneeling at a burned altar on a hilltop above Vienna. The Ottomans burned the church on their way through. Tactical logic. A building on high ground was a potential observation post. The walls are still standing. The altar is blackened but intact. The sky is visible through where the ceiling used to be. His name is Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland. He had every reason to stay home. He did not stay home. Below this hill, spread across the plain as far as the eye can see, is the largest Ottoman army assembled in the 17th century. 150,000 soldiers, 2 months of siege, the walls of Vienna crumbling, the garrison reduced to a fraction of its original strength. The Holy Roman Emperor, the man whose city this is, whose empire this is, has already fled. Sobieski is here. When the mass ends, he will stand up, walk out of the burned church, and look down at what is waiting on the plain below. Then he will give an order that every rational calculation said was impossible. He will order the charge. What happens in the next 3 hours will determine whether Europe falls or survives. And the man who makes it happen will spend the rest of his life watching the continent he saved forget his name. The Ottoman Empire in 1683 was not what it would become, not the declining power it would one day be. What it was at its height, when it was still the most formidable military machine on earth and had been for 2 centuries. The Ottoman Empire controlled territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the gates of Vienna. It had taken Constantinople in 1453, the greatest city in the Christian world, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, fallen in a single afternoon to Ottoman cannon and Ottoman will. It had taken Belgrade. It had taken Budapest. It had pushed into Hungary and Croatia and Transylvania and every corner of southeastern Europe that wasn't protected by mountains or water or walls thick enough to matter. Vienna was the next logical step. It had always been the next logical step. The city sat at the junction of the Danube and the overland trade routes connecting Eastern and Western Europe. Whoever controlled Vienna controlled the gateway to Germany, to France, to the heart of the continent. The Ottomans had tried once before, in 1529, under Suleiman the Magnificent, the greatest sultan in the empire's history. That siege had failed. The walls had held. The season had turned. Suleiman had withdrawn. For 154 years, Vienna had been waiting for them to try again. The man who decided to try again was not the Sultan. Mehmed IV was not a military man. He preferred hunting to campaigning, left the governance of the empire largely to his Grand Vizier. That man was Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful man in the world after the Sultan himself. Kara Mustafa was ambitious in the specific way that becomes dangerous in powerful men. Not ambitious for the empire, but ambitious for himself. He wanted a conquest that would make his name permanent. He wanted to be the man who took Vienna, the man who finished what Suleiman had started, the man who opened the door to Western Europe for the Ottoman army and changed the map of the known world. He began assembling his army in 1682. What he assembled was staggering. The estimates vary. Sources put the Ottoman force at anywhere from 90,000 to 300,000 men. The most reliable figures suggest somewhere around 150,000 soldiers plus an enormous train of support personnel, artillery, supplies, and siege equipment. They came from across the empire. Janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, Tatar auxiliaries, vassal forces from Wallachia and Moldavia and Transylvania. The largest Ottoman army the 17th century had ever seen, moving northwest. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I received intelligence about the approaching army and began to panic. Leopold was not a coward in the simple sense. He was an administrator, a diplomat, a man who understood the political machinery of empire better than its military requirements. He began assembling allies, reaching out to the German princes, to the Pope, to Poland. He also began moving the Habsburg court out of Vienna before the Ottomans arrived. When the Ottoman army appeared on the horizon in July 1683 and laid siege to the city, Leopold was already gone. He had left the defense of his capital to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg and approximately 11,500 soldiers, and departed for the safety of Passau. Starhemberg was a different kind of man. When Kara Mustafa sent envoys demanding the city's surrender, Starhemberg's response was unambiguous. He would not surrender. He would fight to the last drop of blood. He would hold Vienna until relief came, or until there was nobody left to hold it. He sent a message to Leopold and to every potential ally in Europe. Vienna was under siege. The walls would not hold forever. Someone needed to come. In Warsaw, John Sobieski read the message. He had been watching the Ottoman build-up for months. He had signed a mutual defense treaty with Leopold earlier that year, the Treaty of Warsaw, which committed Poland to defend Vienna if it was attacked, and committed Leopold to defend Krakow if it was attacked. It was a sensible arrangement on paper. It was also an arrangement that Leopold had been slow to honor in the past when Poland needed help. Now, Leopold needed help. Sobieski's advisors told him to wait. Poland's eastern border was exposed. The Tatars, Ottoman vassals who raided Polish territory regularly, would see a Polish army marching south and take the opportunity. Leaving Poland to defend someone else's capital was strategically questionable at best and potentially suicidal at worst. Sobieski had been king of Poland for 9 years. He had spent those years fighting against the Ottomans in the south, against the Tatars in the east, against the Cossacks and the Swedes, and every other force that pressed against Poland's borders. He was not a king who made decisions from a comfortable distance. He was a commander who led from the front, who had personally charged into enemy lines enough times that his men would follow him anywhere. He made his decision in late July 1683. He would march. He left Poland with 27,000 troops, including the force that made his army the most feared cavalry in Europe, the Polish winged hussars, heavy lancers armored in steel from head to thigh, carrying 19-foot lances tipped with pennants, wearing the pelts of tigers and leopards across their shoulders, and behind there, saddles, enormous wings made of eagle feathers, arching above their heads, designed to create a specific sound in the wind during a charge, a low humming that grew into a roar as the horses accelerated, a sound that had broken Ottoman formations before and would break them again. On his way south, Sobieski picked up Austrian and German reinforcements until his force totaled approximately 70,000 men. He was the highest-ranking officer present and was immediately given command of the entire relief army, a coalition of Polish, Austrian, Bavarian, Saxon, and other German troops that represented the most significant coordinated military effort in Europe since the Crusades. He led them into the Vienna woods, the forested hills rising above the city, on the night of September 11th. Below them, Vienna was dying. The siege had been running for 59 days. Kara Mustafa's engineers had dug mines under the city's walls, tunnels packed with gunpowder, detonated to collapse the stonework. Multiple sections of the outer walls were gone. The garrison had repelled 18 major assaults, but was now down to roughly 4,000 men capable of fighting. Food was running out. Disease was spreading. Starhemberg, who had been commanding the defense with extraordinary discipline and will, was sick. He had sent desperate messages to Sobieski, asking how much longer he needed to hold. Sobieski had sent back one word: tomorrow. Tomorrow was 12 hours away. Stick around until the end and subscribe if this is your kind of history. Inside Vienna that night, nobody slept. They had not slept properly in 2 months. Sleep in a besieged city is not the same as sleep in a safe one. It is the half-consciousness of men who know that the explosion that kills them could come at any moment, from below their feet if the miners have done their work, from above if the bombardment resumes, from the walls if the next assault breaks through. 2 months of that kind of sleep produces a specific kind of exhaustion that rest cannot fix. The men of the Vienna garrison were not tired. They were used up. Starhemberg had kept them fighting through will alone for the past 3 weeks. His own will, because his body had already given out. He was directing the defense from a litter, carried along the walls so he could see what was happening and give orders. The men who saw him understood what they were looking at. A commander who could not stand was choosing not to leave. That choice meant something. It kept men at their posts, who might otherwise have made the calculation that the walls were lost and nothing they did would change the outcome. The walls were not lost. Not yet, but the margin was gone. The food had been rationed since August. Not carefully rationed, desperately rationed. The kind where the calculation shifts from how much people need to how little they can survive on. The horses that had not been eaten were being saved for the cavalry sorties that happened less and less frequently as the garrison shrank. The civilians who had stayed in Vienna, and many had, unable or unwilling to leave before the siege closed, were doing what civilians in besieged cities always do, finding ways to exist inside shrinking walls, in a city that smelled of gunpowder and sewage, and the specific rot that comes from bodies that cannot be properly buried because the ground outside the walls is controlled by the enemy. A Viennese diarist named Johann Hevenesi recorded what the city looked like from the inside in those final weeks. He wrote about the explosions, not the distant boom of artillery from outside the walls, but the close, violent percussion of Ottoman mines detonating beneath the streets, the ground shaking, buildings cracking, the specific confusion of not knowing whether the sound that just happened was a mine under your feet, or a mortar shell landing somewhere nearby, or something collapsing that had been structurally compromised for weeks and had finally given way. He wrote about the dust, the permanent haze that hung over the city from the constant bombardment, and the collapsed stonework, and the fires that broke out, and sometimes could not be properly fought, because the men who would fight them were needed on the walls. He wrote about Starhemberg, not with reverence, with something closer to bewildered respect. The man was visibly dying by September, and visibly refusing to acknowledge it. He gave orders, in a voice that carried. He made decisions that were rational and precise, and showed no evidence that the body making them was operating on the last reserves of whatever it had been running on for 2 months. He wrote that the men of the garrison had stopped asking whether Vienna would fall. They had started asking only whether it would fall before the relief came. Kara Mustafa did not know that 70,000 men had spent the night moving through the woods above his camp. Sobieski had been planning the approach for days. The Vienna woods, the forested hills rising steeply from the plain northwest of the city, offered both concealment and high ground. An army descending from those hills would have the advantage of elevation and surprise. The disadvantage was the terrain itself. The woods were dense. The slopes were steep and cut through with ravines and vineyards. Moving 70,000 men and their artillery through that terrain in darkness, without alerting an Ottoman army of 150,000 on the plain below, was an almost impossible logistical task. Sobieski managed it. Not perfectly. The advance was slower than planned. The artillery lagged behind. Some units arrived at their positions later than ordered. But by the morning of September 12th, the relief army was in position along the ridge above the plain. The Ottoman camp stretched below them, an enormous city of tents and siege works and artillery positions and supply depots covering miles of ground, and crucially, almost completely undefended, on its northern and western flanks. Kara Mustafa had made a decision that historians have been arguing about ever since. He had intelligence that a relief force was coming. He knew Sobieski had marched. He knew the combined army was somewhere in the hills. What he did not do, what he unaccountably, inexplicably failed to do, was pull his janissaries out of the siege trenches around Vienna to defend against the force coming from the hills. He left his best soldiers in the trenches. He left the flank that faced the hills, defended by cavalry and lighter infantry. He seemed to believe that the ongoing siege was more important than the approaching army, that if Vienna fell before the relief force descended, the relief force would lose its reason to fight. He was wrong, and the decision would cost him everything. The battle began in the morning, not with Sobieski's cavalry, but with the infantry. The Austrian and German forces under Charles of Lorraine engaged the Ottoman left flank, while the Poles positioned themselves on the right. The fighting was brutal and inconclusive for most of the day. The Ottoman forces outnumbered the relief army and fought with the ferocity of men who had spent 2 months investing a siege and were not going to give it up to a force that had arrived 12 hours too late. Inside Vienna, Starhemberg heard the guns from the hills and understood what they meant. He sent his remaining men to the walls to watch. The garrison that had been reduced to exhausted fragments over 59 days of siege now had something they had not had since July, something to wait for. On the hill above the plain, through the afternoon, Sobieski was watching the battle below and making calculations. His cavalry was still in position on the right flank, 20,000 horsemen, the largest cavalry force assembled in Europe in a generation, waiting for the order. He had been planning to hold the charge until the following morning. He had wanted the infantry to do more damage first. He had wanted cleaner conditions. But watching the Ottoman lines below, he saw something shift. The fighting had been going on for hours. The Ottoman soldiers who had been pulling double duty, maintaining the siege of Vienna while fighting the relief force on the flank, were exhausted and disorganized. Kara Mustafa had been moving units back and forth all day, trying to cover the flank attack without abandoning the siege trenches. The result was a force that was neither fully committed to the siege nor fully prepared for the cavalry charge that was about to descend on them. Sobieski saw the moment. He did not wait for morning. A courier rode down the line. The order was passed from commander to commander. The winged hussars, who had been sitting in their armor for hours, lances upright, horses restless, received the command simultaneously across the entire formation. It was approximately 6 in the evening. A Polish nobleman named Jan Chrysostom Pasek was among the cavalry that day. He later wrote about the moment before the charge in terms that make clear he understood he was inside something that would not happen again in his lifetime. He described the sound as the formation began to move, not the thunder of hooves, not yet, but the lower sound that came before it, the creak of leather, the jingle of equipment, 20,000 horses beginning to walk forward in the same direction at the same moment, the wings of the hussars beginning to hum in the air above them. Then the walk became a trot. The trot became a canter. The canter became something that had no name in the vocabulary of the Ottoman soldiers watching from the plain below. The Ottoman soldiers in the plain had never seen anything like this. They had fought cavalry before. Every army in the known world used cavalry. They had fought Polish cavalry before. Lighter horsemen, skirmishers, the kind of force you could organize against, outflank, absorb. What was descending from the hills was not that. What was descending from the hills was 20,000 horses at full gallop in a single formation, moving so fast and so close together that the ground was shaking half a mile away. The sound preceded the sight, the rumble that could have been thunder except there were no clouds, the humming of thousands of wings cutting the air above the men already committed to whatever happened next. The Ottoman cavalry on the flank moved to intercept. They were outnumbered 3-1, and they knew it before the first contact. They engaged anyway, because the Ottoman military had spent 2 centuries building soldiers who held their position regardless of the odds. You did not run before contact. You fought until you could not fight anymore. They could not fight anymore after approximately 10 minutes. The lances came down in the last seconds before contact. 19 feet of hollowed pine tipped with steel, lowered from vertical to horizontal as the horses reached full gallop. A wall of points arriving too fast to dodge, too concentrated to go around. The Ottoman cavalry line broke on the first pass. Not retreated, broke. Riders wheeling away, units behind them losing coherence as the men in front disappeared into the mass of the charge. Sobieski was in the front of it, not as a symbol, physically. A king 53 years old in full armor at the head of 20,000 horses, his lance down like every other hussar in the line, his horse at the same gallop as the horses on either side of him. He had led from the front his entire career. He was leading from the front now. The men immediately behind him could see him. The men behind them knew he was there. That knowledge moved through the formation the way sound moves through water, faster than thought, carrying a specific weight that no order delivered by courier could replicate. The charge punched through the Ottoman cavalry and kept moving. This was the specific quality that made the hussars different from every other heavy cavalry force in Europe. They did not stop after the first impact. Supply wagons carrying spare lances followed the charge specifically, so the hussars could rearm and go again. Once through the line, turn, rearm, charge again. The Ottoman cavalry that had survived the first pass found the formation reforming and coming back before they had finished processing what the first pass had done to them. Within 20 minutes, the Ottoman flank no longer existed as a coherent force. What the charge hit next was not cavalry. The Janissaries in the siege trenches had been facing Vienna for 2 months. Their backs were to the hills. They had heard the fighting on the flank, the specific sounds of cavalry engagement, the screaming of horses, the different quality of noise that meant something serious was happening. Some units had been pulled from the trenches to reinforce the flank. Most had stayed. Their orders were to hold the siege. They held the siege. Then the ground started shaking. A Janissary sergeant named in no surviving account, one of the thousands of elite soldiers who had spent 2 months reducing Vienna's walls methodically, professionally, with the discipline that had made the Janissaries the most feared infantry in the world, would have felt it before he understood it. The vibration in the earth that meant horses, a lot of horses, moving fast, from the wrong direction. He turned around. The charge was already through the flank. It was already in the camp. 20,000 horses moving at full gallop through a military camp that had been designed for a siege, not a battle. Through the tent lines, through the artillery positions, through the supply depots, and the Janissary trenches that had been eating Vienna alive for 2 months were directly in its path. Some units formed up. The best ones, the most disciplined, the most experienced, managed to turn and present organized resistance. They fought hard. They bought time for some of their colleagues to withdraw. They died in the trenches they had spent 2 months digging. The rest broke. Inside Vienna, on the highest point of the remaining walls, Starhemberg heard the Ottoman lines dissolving. The specific change in sound that meant a besieging army was no longer besieging, the reduction in incoming fire, the shift in the quality of shouting from the Ottoman lines, the unmistakable noise of organized military activity becoming disorganized panic. He was still on his litter, still sick, still the commander who had held this city for 59 days through the specific act of refusing to stop being its commander. He gave the order, attack. The Vienna garrison came out of the gates. 4,000 men, exhausted, diseased, many of them wounded, all of them at the end of what human bodies can sustain, walked out of the walls they had defended since July and pushed into the Ottoman siege works from the east, while Sobieski's cavalry tore through them from the west. The Janissaries, who were still in the trenches, were being hit simultaneously from both directions. There was nowhere to go that was not already dangerous. It was over in 30 minutes. The Ottoman camp stretched for miles. It had housed 150,000 soldiers and their equipment for 2 months. Tent cities, artillery parks, supply depots, the accumulated infrastructure of the largest siege operation in the 17th century. In 30 minutes, it had become a place where men were running in every direction that was not toward the hussars. The tents were still standing. The fires were still burning. The food that had been cooking for the evening meal was still on the coals. The army had simply stopped being an army and become a crowd of individuals making individual calculations about survival. Kara Mustafa understood it was over at approximately 7 in the evening. He had been in the fight. He had personally ridden into the Ottoman center trying to hold the Holy Banner, the most sacred military symbol in the Ottoman world, carried into battle as a representation of divine sanction for the campaign. Losing the Holy Banner was not just a military defeat, it was a theological one. He fought to keep it. He failed. He took it with him when he fled, which was the only piece of the disaster he managed to salvage. Because losing the Holy Banner in the field was a disgrace that would have made his execution certain within hours rather than months. He fled south. His army dissolved around him. Not an organized retreat, but a rout. Soldiers throwing down their weapons and running. The camp abandoned with everything inside it. The weapons, the artillery, the supplies that had sustained a 150,000-man army for 2 months. The treasure, the documents that revealed the entire Ottoman order of battle, and the Grand Vizier's tent, the enormous red tent that had been the command center of the siege, still standing in the middle of the abandoned camp, its contents intact. Sobieski walked into it that evening and found it exactly as Kara Mustafa had left it in his flight. The maps, the correspondence, the personal effects of the man who had intended to sleep in Vienna by nightfall. He did not sleep in Vienna. He slept in a field outside Belgrade, and he was already composing the letters that would blame his subordinates for the defeat. Because if the Sultan understood what had actually happened, Kara Mustafa's life would be measured in weeks, not months. He was right about that. Kara Mustafa was strangled on Christmas Day, 1683. The Sultan sent the executioners to Belgrade, where the Grand Vizier was wintering after the retreat. The method was traditional, a silk cord pulled by several men simultaneously, designed to kill quickly and leave the body intact. Kara Mustafa reportedly received the executioners with dignity. He had known they were coming. The letters blaming his subordinates had not worked. Too many survivors had returned to Constantinople with their own accounts. The The Sultan had heard enough versions of what happened outside Vienna to understand that the defeat belonged to the man who had commanded the campaign. His head was sent to Constantinople in a velvet bag. The defeat at Vienna was not immediately understood as the turning point it was. Empires do not collapse in an afternoon. The Ottoman military machine that had absorbed this defeat was still formidable, still larger than any European force, still capable of serious military operations. The war that followed Vienna would last 16 more years. The Ottomans would fight hard for every piece of ground they lost, but they would not get Vienna. They would not threaten it again. And the slow accumulation of losses that began on September 12, 1683, would eventually produce the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the first major peace treaty in which the Ottoman Empire surrendered significant territory rather than gaining it. Hungary returned to Habsburg control. Transylvania returned. The long expansion that had begun with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, 246 years of almost uninterrupted Ottoman advance into Europe, stopped. It stopped on a hill above Vienna with a Polish king kneeling at a burned altar. The man who did it went home. Sobieski returned to Poland in the autumn of 1683 to celebrations that have not been fully replicated since. He was 53 years old. He had marched his country's army halfway across Europe, left Poland undefended to honor a treaty with a man who had already fled his own capital, and won the largest cavalry charge in history against odds that every rational calculation said were impossible. He was the most celebrated military commander in Europe for approximately 6 months. Then the politics started. Leopold I, the Habsburg emperor who had fled Vienna before the siege, who had been absent for the entire 2 months of Ottoman bombardment, who had contributed his forces to the battle but had not been present for it, began the careful work of managing the historical narrative. Vienna was a Habsburg city. The relief of Vienna was a Habsburg story. The fact that the relief had been led by a Polish king who commanded the Habsburg forces was an inconvenient detail that the Habsburg court had no particular interest in emphasizing. European diplomatic correspondence after 1683 increasingly framed the victory as a Christian triumph, a coalition effort, a joint achievement of the Holy League that Pope Innocent XI had assembled. This framing was not wrong exactly. It was a coalition. Other forces had fought. The Austrian and German infantry under Charles of Lorraine had done essential work holding the flanks through the morning. The victory belonged to everyone who fought, but the charge had been Sobieski's. The command had been Sobieski's. The decision to descend from the hills on the evening of September 12th rather than waiting for morning, the tactical choice that determined the outcome, had been Sobieski's alone, and that specific credit was the credit that the narrative slowly, systematically obscured. Sobieski noticed. He spent the remaining years of his reign trying to leverage Vienna into something permanent for Poland. Territorial concessions, diplomatic support, the kind of tangible return that would justify the risk he had taken by leaving his country undefended. He got very little. Leopold was not interested in rewarding Poland beyond the minimum required by the treaty. The German princes had their own priorities. The Pope sent letters of gratitude. Gratitude did not move borders. Poland's borders moved anyway, in the wrong direction. The country Sobieski had left undefended to march to Vienna was already weakening from forces that his absence had accelerated. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a vast but structurally fragile state. Its system of government required unanimous consent in its parliament, which meant any single nobleman could veto any decision, which meant decisive action of any kind was almost impossible to organize. Sobieski had spent his reign fighting this structural weakness as much as he had fought Poland's external enemies. He died in 1696 having not solved it, 13 years after Vienna, still celebrated in Poland, already being forgotten everywhere else. What happened to Poland afterward is one of the more painful ironies in European history. The country that had saved Western Europe in 1683 was partitioned off the map entirely by 1795, carved up between Russia, Prussia, and Austria in 3 successive partitions that erased it as a political entity. It would not reappear on the map until 1918. For 123 years, Poland did not exist as a country. The man who saved Europe watched it forget him. Then the continent erased the country he had saved it to protect. In Vienna today there are monuments to the battle, streets named for September 12th, a church on Kahlenberg Hill, rebuilt, its roof restored, where Mass is still celebrated annually on the anniversary of the charge. The Ottomans burned that church on their way to Vienna. The Poles rebuilt it on their way home. It stands there now with a plaque on the wall acknowledging what happened on that hill on the morning of September 12, 1683. The plaque mentions John Sobieski. It mentions him as one name among several. His contribution noted, his command not emphasized, his name not on the street outside. Leopold I has a square in Vienna, a large one named after him. The man who fled his own city while a Polish king stayed to defend it has a square in the city that Polish king saved. Both of those things are true simultaneously. The question this story keeps asking, the one that the plaques and the squares and the selective historical memory all circle around without answering, is whether the forgetting was accidental or deliberate, whether Vienna simply moved on, the way cities do after catastrophe, absorbed the victory into its own identity, forgot the inconvenient foreign king who made it possible, or whether there was something more intentional in the way the narrative shifted, the way the coalition framing expanded to absorb the specifically Polish contribution, the way Leopold's court worked to ensure that the story of Vienna was ultimately a story about Vienna. He had won the largest cavalry charge in history. He had saved the continent, and the continent had looked at what he gave it and decided the gift was better remembered without the giver. History forgot his name. It took some effort. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Did Sobieski deserve better? And does it matter that Europe forgot him? The plaque on Kahlenberg Hill has his name on it. The square in Vienna belongs to the man who fled. History has been arguing about that for 3 centuries. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories